What would you do if the last door left open to you in this world was one nobody else wanted, a door half buried in snow, hanging crooked on a single hinge, belonging to a place folks in town crossed themselves to avoid? Eliza Mercer was 29 years old when she found herself standing before such a door, alone, with 2 trunks, a wool coat gone thin at the elbows, and $11 sewn into the hem of her petticoat. 3 weeks earlier she had been a rancher's daughter-in-law with a warm hearth and a husband's name to shelter under. Then Thomas Mercer had died of a fever that took him in 9 days, and his father, Silas Mercer, a hard man who had never forgiven her for being poor when she married into his family, told her plainly that the Mercer land was for Mercer blood, and she carried none of it in her veins. He gave her a wagon ride to the edge of Coldwater Forks, Wyoming territory, and $11, and told her not to come back. With that $11, in the bitter January of 1887, Eliza did something the whole town would call foolish. She bought the abandoned Army way station up in the frozen Foothills, sold off at a tax auction for $9 because no one else would touch it, on account of the stories. They said something was sealed up in those crumbling walls that had been waiting 20 years to be found, something that would not only save one desperate widow, but would end up restoring an entire town that had quietly been dying without ever knowing why. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eliza Mercer. If you're watching this from a place that people have written off as finished, tell us in the comments, we'd love to know where you're from. Eliza had not always been a woman who counted coins twice before spending them. She had been raised 40 miles east of Coldwater Forks, in a modest clapboard house behind her father's locksmith shop, where the smell of oil and hot metal had been as familiar to her as bread baking. Her father, Josiah Vane, was a quiet, exacting man who had come west from Pennsylvania with a trunk of tools and a belief, which he passed to his only daughter, that nothing in this world was truly broken, only misunderstood, or unattended to, or waiting for someone patient enough to listen to what it needed. He taught her to read a lock the way other fathers taught daughters to read scripture, with reverence, and a conviction that every mechanism, like every person, had a story written into its workings, if you were willing to look closely enough. Eliza spent her girlhood afternoons at his workbench, small hands turning picks and files long before they turned hairpins or embroidery needles, and she absorbed something from him that would outlast the shop itself, which burned to its foundations the winter she turned 16, taking with it her father's health and, not long after, his life. She might have drifted after that, as many young women without fortune did, but her mother's people had left her a stubborn streak and a talent for numbers, and she found work first as a seamstress and then, more happily, as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant in the town of Larkspur, where she learned to read a ledger the same careful way her father had taught her to read a lock, watching for the entry that didn't sit right, the sum that almost, but not quite, added up. It was in Larkspur that she met Thomas Mercer, a rancher's son with an easy laugh and gentle hands, who admired the quickness of her mind more than he ever seemed to notice the plainness of her dowry. They married in the spring of 1883, and for 4 years Eliza believed she had found, in Thomas, a permanent shelter from all the uncertainty her young life had handed her. She was wrong about that, though not through any fault of his. Thomas Mercer was, by every account, a good and gentle man, and his death was no judgment on the life they had built together, only the plain cruelty of fever moving faster than any doctor 40 miles away could ride. What Eliza carried out of those years, more valuable in the end than any inheritance, was the discipline her father had planted in her and the sharpness her bookkeeping had honed, an instinct for hidden order beneath apparent ruin, and a stubborn, quiet refusal to accept that a thing, or a person, was worthless simply because someone louder had declared it so. She did not know, standing at the edge of Silas Mercer's land with her 2 trunks and her $11, that this instinct was about to become the only inheritance she would ever need. The fall, when it came swiftly, in the manner of a badly built dam giving way all at once rather than leaking slow. Silas Mercer had never approved of his son's marriage, believing that Thomas, as the last living Mercer son, owed his family a wife with land or cattle to bring into the union, not a bookkeeper's daughter with nothing but her wits. He had tolerated Eliza for Thomas's sake, coldly and at a distance, the way a man tolerates whether he cannot change. When Thomas died, that toleration died with him. Eliza had believed, in her grief, that she might at least be permitted to remain in the small cabin she and Thomas had built a half-mile from the main house, to keep the garden going and take in mending until she found her footing. Silas disabused her of that hope within a week of the funeral. He stood in the doorway of her own kitchen, hat still on his head, and told her that the cabin, the land beneath it, and everything on it belonged to the Mercer name, and that she was, and always had been, a guest whose welcome had run its course. There was no cruelty in his voice, which somehow made it worse. He spoke the way a man speaks of settling a debt, as if grief itself were merely another account to be closed. She was given 3 days to gather what belonged to her, which amounted, in the end, to 2 trunks of clothing, her mother's quilt, her father's old leather satchel of locksmith's tools that she had never had the heart to sell, and the small tin box in which she kept what money remained after the funeral costs, $11 in silver and scrip. Silas drove her himself the 12 miles into Coldwater Forks, not out of kindness but, she suspected, so that he could be certain she had truly gone, and left her standing outside the mercantile with her trunks in the frozen mud of the street, the whole town watching from behind frosted windows the particular spectacle of a respectable young widow become, in the space of an afternoon, a woman with nowhere to sleep. Coldwater Forks was not, that winter, a town with much charity to spare. The silver mine that had built it 2 decades before had gone quiet years earlier, and the cattle trade that had briefly revived its fortunes was suffering under a hard winter and harder debts owed to the town's one bank, run by a smooth, careful man named Harlan Reeve, who held the paper on nearly every business and homestead within 20 miles and was not known for patience with those who fell behind. Eliza spent 2 nights in the back room of the boarding house on credit she could not truly afford, turning over in her mind the arithmetic of her situation with the same cold clarity she had once turned over a merchant's books, and arriving each time at the same unhappy total, $11, minus lodging, minus food, divided by however many days it might take to find work in a town with little to offer, equaled a woman who would be sleeping in the street inside a fortnight. Unless she did something decisive. It was in the boarding-house parlor that she overheard 2 men from the county office discussing the tax auction to be held that Saturday on the courthouse steps, a scattering of forfeited claims and abandoned structures, the county eager to be rid of them for whatever pittance they might bring rather than continue paying to insure against their liability. Among the parcels was one that made the older man lower his voice, the way people lower their voices around subjects that still frighten them a little, the old Army way station up in the foothills above Coldwater Creek, abandoned since the winter of '68, when the small garrison stationed there during the last uneasy years of the frontier campaigns had been withdrawn and the post quietly shuttered. Nobody had lived in it since. Nobody, the man said, wanted to. There were stories, a sergeant who had vanished the same season the post closed, rumors of gunfire in the night that no one could ever properly explain, the sense, shared by more than one hunter who had sheltered there in a storm, that the place did not want visitors. The county had tried 3 times over the years to sell the parcel and failed each time. This year, the man said, chuckling, they'd likely have to pay someone to take it. Eliza sat very still in her corner of the parlor, her father's voice rising unbidden in her memory, nothing in this world is truly broken, only misunderstood, and by the time the 2 men had moved on to other gossip, she had already begun, in the quiet arithmetic of her mind, to calculate what a roof, however haunted, however forsaken, might be worth to a woman who otherwise had none. The auction on Saturday was a brief and businesslike affair, held in a wind that cut through wool like it was muslin, and Eliza was the only bidder for the way station parcel. The county clerk, a thin, harried man named Foss, seemed almost apologetic as he took her money, $9, the reserve price, paid entirely in silver, and handed her a deed to 40 acres of foothill scrub and 1 stone and timber building that the record described, with a bureaucrat's flat indifference, as Army Way Station No. 4, condition unknown, structure unsound. Several onlookers on the courthouse steps did not bother to hide their pity, and one older woman, wrapped in a shawl the color of ash, caught Eliza's sleeve as she turned to go and said, not unkindly, that she ought to reconsider, that some doors were better left shut. Eliza thanked her for her concern and did not reconsider, because she had, by then, exactly $2 left to her name and nowhere else in the world to be. She hired a boy with a mule cart to carry her trunks the 6 miles up into the foothills, along a trail that climbed steadily through stands of lodgepole pine dusted white, the cold water rushing black and half frozen in its gorge below, until the trees opened onto a shallow bowl of land, and there, at last, stood the way station, squat, gray, half swallowed by drifted snow, its roof sagging at one corner like a shoulder set wrong after a break. The boy would not carry her trunks past the threshold. He set them down in the yard, took his fee, and left at a pace that suggested he did not care to be caught by darkness on that trail, and Eliza stood alone before the crooked door of the only home she now possessed in the world, and pushed it open. Inside, the way station smelled of dust and cold stone and the particular staleness of air that has not moved in 20 years. A single main room held a stone hearth choked with old ash, a plank table furred with grime, 2 iron bedsteads stripped to their frames, and, along the far wall, a heavy timber door reinforced with iron strapping that had clearly once served as the post's arms room, secured by a lock so rusted and swollen with age that it looked less like a mechanism than a scar. It was, Eliza thought, running her fingers over its pitted iron face, exactly the kind of lock her father would have loved, stubborn, neglected, certain that no one remaining in the world had the patience to open it. She did not open it that first night. That first night she was occupied only with survival, clearing the hearth, coaxing a fire from scavenged dead wood and the broken slats of an old shelf, melting snow for water, wrapping herself in her mother's quilt on the least broken of the 2 bedsteads, and listening to the wind work at the loose roof shingles while she told herself, with more conviction than she entirely felt, that she had not made a terrible mistake. It was on the 3rd day, once the fire had properly warmed the stone walls and her hands had stopped shaking from cold long enough to hold a tool steady, that Eliza knelt before the arms room door with her father's old leather satchel open beside her, and began, patiently, the way he had taught her, to listen to what the lock needed. It took her the better part of an afternoon, working by lamplight as the short winter day closed early outside the shuttered windows, easing rust-free with oil rendered from bacon fat, working her father's finest pick with fingers gone half numb, until at last, with a groan of protest that seemed to come from the whole building rather than the lock alone, the mechanism gave, and the heavy door swung inward on hinges that had not moved since Ulysses Grant sat in the White House. What lay inside, at first glance, seemed only to confirm the room's official designation: shelves of empty gun racks, a scatter of rotted leather harness, crates gone soft and gray with damp. But Eliza's eye, trained by years of bookkeeping to notice what did not sit right, caught on the floorboards at the room's rear corner, which lay slightly proud of their neighbors, their edges too clean, too evenly cut, for boards that had simply warped with age. She knelt, and worked her fingers into the seam, and pried, and the board lifted with the particular reluctant ease of wood that has been lifted and replaced many times before by careful hands. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle but intact, lay a small, iron-strapped chest no larger than a hatbox, and beside it, a slim leather dispatch case stamped, in flaking gold, with a regimental insignia and a name, Sergeant T. Calloway, Quartermaster. She sat back on her heels in the lamplight, her heart beating hard against her ribs, and asked herself the same question that we now ask you: what secrets do you think were waiting for her in that box? Eliza did not open the chest that night. Something in her, perhaps her father's old instinct that a lock respected is a lock that yields its truth honestly, told her to begin instead with the dispatch case, whose leather straps, though stiff, gave way more gently to her hands. Inside she found papers, remarkably preserved by the dry mountain cold, a bundle of letters tied with cord gone brittle as straw, and a slim, cloth-bound ledger whose pages, when she opened them by lamplight, were filled with a neat, careful military hand recording, in the flat language of quartermaster accounts, the movement of supplies and payroll through way station number 4 across the terrible winter of 1867 into 1868, a winter, she would later learn from the letters themselves, when an early blizzard had trapped the small garrison and the settlers sheltering near it for 11 weeks, when rations had run desperately short, and when a promised payroll shipment and relief supply train, sent up from the territorial capital, had somehow, according to the official record filed afterward, never arrived at all, lost to the storm along with the men said to be escorting it. The ledger told a different story than the official record had. In careful columns, Sergeant Thomas Calloway had recorded the actual arrival of that payroll and relief shipment on the 14th of December. 1867, gold coin for the soldiers' overdue wages, and crates of flour, salt pork, and medicine meant to see the garrison and the huddled families sheltering near it through the worst of the winter. And in a hand that grew visibly less steady across the following pages, he had recorded as well the growing and increasingly desperate orders of his commanding officer, a Major Bartholomew Reeve, to withhold the relief supplies from distribution, to report the shipment as lost in the storm, and to prepare the payroll gold for private transport south come the spring thaw, orders which Calloway, in the ledger's final, hurried entries, recorded that he had refused. The last entry, dated the second week of January 1868, read only that he intended to hide the cash where the Major could not reach it until honest men arrived to whom he could report the truth, and that if anything should happen to him, he prayed whoever found this record would see that the people of Coldwater Forks, for that had been the settlement's name even then, received what had always been meant for them. Sergeant Calloway was never seen again. The letters, written by his sister in Ohio across the following 2 years, begged successive army offices for word of her brother, listed at last as a deserter, his pension and good name forfeit, his family left with nothing but a folded flag of shame instead of grief. Eliza read them by lamplight with tears freezing faintly on her lashes, understanding at last why the mountain wind through that broken roof had always sounded, to the fearful, like gunfire in the dark, and understanding too, with a bookkeeper's cold clarity, precisely whose family name it was that had prospered so remarkably in Coldwater Forks in the 20 years since, the smooth, careful banker who now held the paper on nearly every struggling homestead in the valley, bore the name Reeve, and was, as she would soon confirm, the grandson of the very major whose orders Sergeant Calloway had refused to obey. She opened the iron chest last of all, and found within it what the ledger had promised, payroll gold, dulled with age but uncorrupted, more coin than she had seen in her life, resting alongside a handful of the garrison's service revolvers, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, evidently secreted away by Calloway as insurance against a confrontation he must have feared was coming. Eliza sat a long while in that cold arms room with the lamplight guttering low, the gold cold and heavy in her palms, and understood, with a certainty that settled into her like the striking of a bell, that this fortune had never truly been lost, only waiting, as her father had always insisted such things wait, for someone patient enough, and honest enough, to finally listen to what it needed. Word travels fast in a small mountain town, even word a woman would rather keep to herself, and Eliza had not managed to keep her discovery entirely quiet. She had needed, after all, to consult the county recorder about the provenance of old military property found upon a deeded parcel, and Foss the clerk, decent man though he was not immune to the pull of remarkable gossip. Within a fortnight, most of Coldwater Forks knew that the widow who had bought the haunted way station for $9 had found something up there worth a fortune, though the precise nature of it grew more fantastical with each retelling. It was perhaps inevitable, then, that Harlan Reeve himself would eventually appear at her door, driving a fine trap up the Foothill trail in a coat too well cut for the season, his manner all warm concern and neighborly interest, offering, with the smoothness of a man accustomed to being believed, to purchase the way station parcel outright, sight unseen, for a sum considerably above its assessed value, out of what he called simple civic-mindedness, a wish to see an unfortunate widow properly settled. Eliza, who had spent 4 evenings by then reading and rereading Sergeant Calloway's ledger until she could nearly recite its entries by heart, understood precisely what Harlan Reeve was truly offering to buy, and what he hoped to bury a second time. She declined his offer, politely but without hesitation, and watched something flicker and harden behind his neighborly smile, the particular coldness of a man discovering that a problem he had believed simple was not simple at all. He left her doorway with a warning thinly dressed as courtesy, observing that a lone woman with an unclear claim to disputed military property might find the county considerably less friendly than she supposed, and that questions about old, half-mad quartermaster sergeants were rarely worth the trouble they stirred for respectable families still living in the town. The weeks that followed tested Eliza's resolve more severely than the frozen foothills ever had. Harlan Reeve, it emerged, held considerable influence not merely over the town's finances but over its opinion, and rumors began circulating that the widow up at the old way station had gone strange in her grief, that she was hoarding stolen army property, that her claim to the parcel itself might be void on some technicality the bank's lawyer was already investigating. The county sheriff, a cautious man named Dunmore who owed his own modest ranch mortgage to Reeves' bank, rode up to question her twice, each time with evident discomfort, each time finding nothing improper in a legally purchased deed and a lockbox she had every right, as landowner, to have opened. Twice her fence line was cut and her single milk goat let loose into the snow. Once, someone attempted to fire the woodshed in the dead of night, extinguished only by a lucky, bitter rain. Eliza understood these for what they were, not the actions of ghosts, but of a frightened man with a family name to protect, testing how much fear it would take to make a woman with nothing left to lose simply give up and go away. She did not give up, and she did not go away, and what would you have done, in her place, with a town's history in your hands and a family that had prospered from a dead man's disgrace still holding every mortgage in the valley? Eliza chose, in the end, not to fight Harlan Reeve in the shadows where he was strongest, but to bring Sergeant Calloway's story into the light where he was weakest. She wrote, with the same careful, exacting hand her father had taught her for ledgers, a full and documented account of what the papers contained, and she made 3 copies of it, along with photographic reproductions of the ledger's key pages, arranged through a traveling photographer she paid with 2 of the smaller gold coins. 1 copy she sent by registered post to the Regional Army Records Office in Cheyenne, formally requesting the posthumous review of Sergeant Thomas Calloway's desertion charge in light of newly discovered evidence. 1 copy she delivered to the territorial newspaper in the county seat, whose editor, a wry, weathered man named Otis Prynne with no particular love for banks, found the story of a wronged quartermaster and a town's secret fortune considerably too good to leave unprinted. And the 3rd copy she kept, carried always in her father's old satchel, in case the first 2 should somehow meet with misfortune before they reached honest eyes. The story broke in Prynne's newspaper on a Thursday in early March, under a headline that named neither Eliza's fortune nor its precise sum, but told plainly the tale of a widow's discovery, a soldier's stolen honor, and a major's cover-up whose family still, by strange coincidence, held every note of debt in Coldwater Forks. The reaction in town was immediate and, for Harlan Reeve, deeply unwelcome. Men who had quietly resented his tightening grip on their mortgages for years found in Calloway's story a shape for a suspicion they had long felt but never been able to name, that the Reeve fortune had never been entirely honest, that the family's rise had been built, in some measure neither provable nor entirely deniable until now, upon the ruin of others. Harlan Reeve's smooth manner did not survive the scrutiny. Within days depositors were withdrawing what savings they had rather than trust their money to his bank a moment longer, and by the time a formal Army inquiry official arrived from Cheyenne 3 weeks later to review Eliza's evidence, Reeves' own lawyer was already advising him, in tones Eliza heard secondhand from Foss, that his soundest course was cooperation rather than further denial. The inquiry, conducted with the plodding thoroughness of military bureaucracy, took the better part of 2 months, but its conclusion, when it came in early May, was unambiguous. Sergeant Thomas Calloway had been wrongly charged, his desertion designation struck from the record, his conduct in refusing an unlawful order to withhold relief supplies from starving civilians commended rather than condemned. It was, the Army acknowledged, impossible after 20 years and the death of every principal witness to prove with certainty what fate Calloway himself had met, though Eliza had her own quiet theory, formed from a half-healed break she had noticed in the arms room's rear wall, that a man protecting the truth in a lonely mountain post, against a commanding officer growing desperate, had not survived to tell it himself, and had trusted instead to a locked door and a patient stranger to tell it for him. As for the payroll gold, the inquiry determined, after considerable and Eliza suspected, somewhat reluctant deliberation, that as lawfully abandoned property recovered upon a legally purchased parcel, with no surviving claimant able to establish prior right beyond the Army's own settled payroll accounts from 2 decades past, it belonged to her outright, a ruling Otis Prynne's newspaper reported with evident satisfaction under the headline that finally did name a sum, and which every household in Coldwater Forks read with something between astonishment and vindication. Eliza Mercer became, in the space of that single spring, the wealthiest woman in the county, and it is here that her father's old teaching, more than the gold itself, determined the true shape of what came next. She had not forgotten, in her months of hardship, the particular ache of watching a town's charity run thin, nor the families she had come to know in Coldwater Forks who were themselves only a bad season away from the ruin Silas Mercer had once pushed her toward. Rather than retreat into comfortable solitude with her fortune, Eliza used it, deliberately and publicly, to rebuild what Harlan Reeves' failing bank had left in disrepair. She purchased and forgave outright a portion of the most desperate mortgages the bank was forced to liquidate as depositors fled, quietly and without publicity, through Otis Prynne acting as intermediary so that no family need feel the sting of charity. She funded the rebuilding of the schoolhouse, whose roof had leaked for 3 winters running because the town could never quite spare the funds, and endowed it further with a small library, remembering her own girlhood hunger for books beyond her father's modest shelf. She commissioned, at the mining company's old and long idle mill site, the construction of a proper grist mill to serve the valley's farmers, who had for years been forced to haul their grain a costly 2 days' journey to the nearest working mill, and she hired, as its first manager, Sergeant Calloway's own great-nephew, traced through correspondence with the family in Ohio, so that some measure of the Calloway name might return, in dignity, to the very valley it had once been wronged in serving. Harlan Reeve did not go to prison, for no statute could reach across 20 years to punish a dead major's sins upon a living grandson who had, however coldly, broken no law himself in inheriting a fortune he had not personally stolen. But his bank did not survive the season, bought out at last, at Eliza's quiet insistence, by a sound cooperative institution formed by the town's own ranchers and merchants, with terms fair enough that even those who had once feared Reeve found themselves, within a year, prospering under arrangements he would never have offered. Reeve himself left Coldwater Forks before the first snow of the following winter, his name no longer commanding the deference it once had, and if there was any true justice in his quiet departure, it was only this, that he left the valley as poor in standing as Sergeant Calloway had once been made to seem, while the sergeant's own name, restored at last, was carved that autumn into a modest granite marker Eliza commissioned for the town square, honoring a man who had chosen honesty over obedience and paid for it with everything he had. We began this story by asking you what you would do if the only thing left to you in the world was a door nobody else wanted to open. Eliza Mercer, cast out into the frozen foothills above Coldwater Forks with $11 and her father's old satchel of tools, chose to open that door anyway, not because she believed treasure lay behind it, but because she had been raised to believe that nothing broken, abandoned, or overlooked was ever truly worthless, only waiting for someone patient enough to listen. What she found there was never simply gold. It was a dead man's stolen honor, a town's quiet inheritance of injustice, and, in the end, a chance to prove that the same careful hands once turned away by a bitter father-in-law could turn a rusted lock, a forgotten ledger, and a haunted room into the restoration of an entire valley. Silas Mercer, we might tell you, wrote to her once more that following year, hearing of her fortune, hoping perhaps to mend what pride had broken. Eliza answered him with characteristic dignity, forgiving him without forgetting, and sent, quietly, enough to see his own ranch through a hard season, because she had learned, in that cold arms room, that restoration mattered more than reckoning. Coldwater Forks remembers her still, not as the widow who found a fortune, but as the woman who found what everyone else had already given up on, and made it whole. Thank you for spending this time with Eliza's story, and with us. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need a reminder that what looks abandoned is not always worthless, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? Until next time, stay close.